The rain battered the 20-foot windows of my Seattle loft, but I only heard the voicemail playing on speaker. It was my father, James. "No, hello. Just a bark demand. Sophia, stop playing games. Tyler needs those vector files for his pitch deck. Investors are waiting. Send them. Now." I stared at the phone, sipping my espresso. He didn't know I'd moved states 6 months ago. He didn't know I ran a 6-figure agency. He only knew his golden child needed a logo, and I was the help. The audacity wasn't hurtful anymore. It was breathtaking. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand why I didn't flinch at that voicemail, you have to understand the architecture of my family. I wasn't just the black sheep. I was the glass child. You look right through glass to see the view behind it. For my parents, James and Rachel, the view was always Tyler. Tyler was 26, a self-proclaimed visionary. In our household, being a visionary meant being unemployed with expensive taste. He had ideas, thousands of them. An Uber for dog walkers. A cryptocurrency based on carbon credits. My parents called him a genius. They called me, well, they didn't really call me anything unless they needed tech support or someone to proofread Tyler's investment decks. I remember a specific dinner when I was 22. I had just spent 6 months teaching myself the entire Adobe Creative Suite and front-end coding. I was bursting to tell them I'd landed my first freelance contract. I opened my mouth, but Tyler interrupted. He wanted to talk about his new podcast idea. It was going to revolutionize the wellness industry. My father's eyes, which had been glazed over while I was clearing my throat, suddenly lit up. He leaned in. My mother smiled, that beatific, worshipful smile she saved exclusively for him. It wasn't just rude, it was optical. They were focusing their lens entirely on him, and I was just the empty space in the foreground. That is the trauma of transparency. It's not that they hate you. It's that you don't register as a solid object. You learn to be quiet so you don't shatter. You learn that your value isn't intrinsic, it's structural. I was the window pane keeping the rain out while they admired the golden boy inside. I was the load-bearing wall they drilled holes into to hang pictures of him. My utility was the only thing that made me visible. If I wasn't being useful, fixing the Wi-Fi, editing a resume, lending $50 that never came back, I simply ceased to exist in their reality. But here is the secret advantage of being invisible. Nobody watches what you're building. While my parents remortgaged their souls to fund Tyler's networking trips to Bali trips that resulted in 0 business plans and a lot of sunburn, I was in the attic. I wasn't just playing on my computer. I was studying the market. I was learning the psychology of branding. I was analyzing why businesses failed so I could ensure mine wouldn't. I treated my neglect like a masterclass in independence. They thought I was withdrawn. I wasn't withdrawn. I was in development. I realized early on that love in that house was a finite resource and Tyler had a monopoly, so I stopped trying to acquire it. Instead, I started acquiring leverage. I stopped seeing them as parents and started seeing them as a case study in bad management. They were pouring capital into a sinking asset while ignoring the profit center right under their nose. I became the architect of my own value, and architects don't cry over bad clients. They just wait for the contract to expire. And looking at my father's name on my phone screen, I knew the contract was finally up. While Tyler was burning through $65,000 of my parents' home equity line of credit on a tech incubator retreat in Bali, which mostly involved surfing and Instagram stories about hustle culture, I was securing my Bisitaviri, first micro investments. My seed capital wasn't a handout from the bank of mom and dad. It was $185 for a logo design I bid for on a freelancing site. I did the work at 3 a.m, the blue light of my monitor, the only thing illuminating the cramped attic. When the payment cleared, I stared at the screen. It felt illicit, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had generated value without their permission. I reinvested every cent. I treated my skill set like a compounding asset. Better software, a faster processor, a subscription to market research data. While Tyler was explaining to my father that his app was pre-revenue because the world wasn't ready for his genius, I was scaling. By the time he was asking for a second round of family funding for a platform that didn't have a single line of code written, I was closing $5,000 branding packages. I operated under the name Aura Design. It sounded big, faceless, corporate. Nobody knew the CEO was the 24-year-old girl eating ramen in her parents' attic so she could save for a server rack. Then came the whale, A Fortune 500 tech firm needed a complete UI overhaul. I pitched against agencies with glass offices and espresso machines. I didn't have overhead. I had hunger. I presented a strategy so tight it left no room for argument. When the retainer contract landed in my inbox, $15,000 a month renewable, I didn't call my mother. I didn't pop champagne with my father. I knew better. In their economy, my success would simply be viewed as a reserve fund for Tyler. My profit margins would be seized to cover his losses. So, I made a strategic withdrawal. I used the first month's retainer to sign the lease on this loft in Seattle. 3,000 square feet of industrial concrete, rain gray light, and silence. I moved my things out in a rental van while my parents were attending one of Tyler's launch parties for a website that crashed 10 minutes after going live. They didn't notice I was gone for 3 days. When my mother finally called, it wasn't to ask where I was. It was to ask if I had seen Tyler's Forbes interview, a paid placement, of course. She didn't ask about my address. She didn't ask about my job. She assumed I was scraping by, just another starving artist failing to launch. I let her believe it. I realized that my anonymity was my greatest asset. I wasn't hiding. I was diversifying my portfolio away from a toxic market. I had built a secret empire right under their noses, and the best part was, they never looked down long enough to see the foundation being poured. The silence of my loft was shattered not by a celebration but by an interrogation. When I finally answered my mother's call, there was no preamble, no pleasantries. Rachel didn't ask about my new city or my new life. She asked why I was sabotaging the family. According to her, Tyler's revolutionary app, which was still little more than a slide deck and a landing page, was failing to gain traction because the branding didn't pop. It wasn't the lack of a business model. It wasn't the fact that Tyler spent his development budget on a launch party for a product that didn't exist. It was the logo. And since I was the artist, the failure was mine to fix. She demanded I drop my paying clients to do a complete rebrand for Tyler. Pro bono, of course. When I mentioned I had a schedule, she exploded. She told me I was ungrateful. She threw my own survival in my face, claiming my current success was only possible because they had supported me. It was gaslighting of the highest order. They hadn't supported me, they had neglected me, and I had thrived in the vacuum they left behind. But the most terrifying part of the call wasn't the entitlement. It was the financial desperation leaking through her voice. She mentioned they were meeting with a loan officer. They were planning to remortgage the house to give Tyler another $65,000 runway. I sat there gripping the phone, listening to them discuss financial suicide with the casual tone of someone ordering dinner, and that is when I understood the mechanism at play. It wasn't love. It was the sunk cost fallacy. My parents had invested decades of emotional capital and hundreds of thousands of dollars into the narrative that Tyler was the chosen one. He was their primary asset. To admit now that he was a liability, that he was lazy, incompetent, and entitled would cause a psychological break. It would mean admitting that they had bet the farm on a losing horse while ignoring the thoroughbred in the stable. This was cognitive dissonance in real time. The more Tyler failed, the more money they had to pour in to justify the previous investments. They weren't funding a business anymore. They were funding their own delusions. They couldn't stop. If they stopped, the reality of their negligence toward me and their foolishness toward him would crash down on them. They had to double down. They had to believe that one more check, one more logo, one more loan would finally turn the tide and validate their entire parenting philosophy. I realized then that I wasn't arguing with parents. I was negotiating with gambling addicts, chasing a loss. Logic would not work here. Emotional appeals would not work. They were emotionally insolvent, borrowing against a future that didn't exist. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt the cold clinical detachment of a surgeon looking at a patient who refuses to stop smoking while on oxygen. I realized that if I wanted to survive this, I couldn't be their daughter. I had to be a creditor. And creditors don't work for free. I didn't answer my mother's demand to work for free. I hung up the phone and opened my agency's billing software. I created a new client profile. Under company name, I typed the name of Tyler's Vaporware venture. Under services, I listed comprehensive brand strategy, visual identity overhaul, and expedited delivery. Then came the price tag. My standard corporate rate for a rush job of this magnitude was $25,000. I didn't offer a family discount. I added a clause requiring 100% payment upfront before a single pixel was moved. I attached the invoice to a standard service agreement, 30 pages of legal protection that I used for Fortune 500 clients, and emailed it to my father. I didn't sign it "Love Sophia." I signed it, Sophia, CEO, Aura Design. The reaction was immediate. My phone lit up with my father's number less than 2 minutes after I hit send. I let it ring 3 times before answering, putting him on speaker while I poured a glass of sparkling water. He wasn't speaking. He was shouting. He called me delusional. He called me a predator. He asked how I could sleep at night, charging my own flesh and blood for a few drawings. I waited for him to pause for breath. When he finally stopped, my voice was devoid of any daughterly affection. I spoke with the cadence of a consultant addressing a difficult stakeholder. I told him that he had just spent 20 minutes telling me how critical this app was, how investors were lining up, and how this business was going to be the family legacy. If the business is real, I said, then $25,000 is a standard operating expense. If the business cannot support a market rate branding package, then it certainly isn't ready for venture capital. There was a silence on the other end that was heavy with shock. I had cornered him with his own logic. If he admitted he couldn't pay, he was admitting Tyler's business was a hobby. If he paid, he was validating my worth for the first time in his life. He was trapped between his ego and his bank account. I didn't back down. I told him the offer expired in 24 hours. I told him that if he wanted professional results, he had to treat me like a professional, not a pet. I heard him sputtering, looking for an angle, a way to guilt me back into submission. But I was immune. I had turned the emotional dynamic into a transactional one. You want the product, pay the invoice. Finally, his voice dropped to a low, seething growl. He told me I was arrogant. He told me I had forgotten where I came from. Then he said something that sealed his fate. He said he would pay it. He said he would write the check just to prove that he believed in Tyler more than I did, and when the business took off, I wouldn't see a dime of the equity. I told him to check his email for the wire instructions. I hung up and stared at the city lights. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like an investigator who had just laid a trap and watched the suspect walk right into it. He was going to pay. He was going to drain whatever liquidity he had left to prove a point. And in doing so, he was about to hand me the evidence that would destroy everything. The notification pinged on my phone the next morning while I was in a status meeting with my team. Payment received. But it wasn't the wire transfer I expected. It was a scanned image of a cashier's check emailed by my father with the subject line, "Here is your money. Now do your job." I opened the attachment. The check was for $25,000 drawn from a bank I didn't recognize. Something about it felt off. Not the check itself, it looked legitimate, but the source. My parents banked at a small credit union in Oregon. This was from an international investment bank. I forwarded the image to my accountant, a woman named Elena, who could spot a decimal error from across a room. "Verify this," I typed. "I want to make sure it clears before we start." 20 minutes later, Elena called me. Her voice was tight. "Sophia, we have a problem. The routing number is valid, but this account, it's flagged. It's connected to a high-risk offshore entity." My blood ran cold. Who is it? It's signed by a Tyler J. Vances as a trustee for the Vance Family Retirement Trust. "Sophia, did your parents move their retirement funds into a trust managed by your brother?" The floor dropped out from under me. There was no trust. My parents' retirement was in a standard 401k and a savings account they had been building since the 80s. I realized with sickening clarity what had happened. My parents hadn't paid me. Tyler had, but he hadn't used his own money. I spent the next 3 hours digging. I used every resource I had: public records, contacts in finance, a private investigator I kept on retainer for background checks. The picture that emerged was a financial horror story. Tyler hadn't just been networking in Bali. He had been forging documents. 6 months ago, he had convinced my parents to sign what they thought were incorporation papers for his startup. In reality, they had signed power of attorney over their financial assets. He had liquidated their entire 401k. He had taken out a fraudulent line of credit against their home, maxing it out to the limit of $250,000. The money hadn't gone into app development. It had gone into crypto wallets, luxury rentals, and a shell company in the Cayman Islands. And now he had used the last dregs of their life savings to pay me, likely to keep the charade going just a few weeks longer. The final piece of the puzzle arrived via an alert from my PI. A flight manifest. Tyler Vance had boarded a one-way flight to Bali 3 hours ago. He was gone. He had drained them dry, paid me my hush money with their own stolen funds, and fled the country. I stared at the evidence spread across my screens. This wasn't just bad business. It was grand larceny, elder abuse, wire fraud. My parents weren't just broke. They were victims of a crime committed by the son they worshipped, and they had absolutely no idea. I held the smoking gun that would destroy their world. The question wasn't if I should pull the trigger. It was how to do it without getting hit by the shrapnel. I called my father. Not to accuse him, but to summon him. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. I told him there was a problem with the payment, and he needed to get on a video call immediately. He tried to argue, tried to bluster about how busy he was, but something in my tone, a cold, flat finality, stopped him. 10 minutes later, his face appeared on my screen. My mother was beside him, looking anxious. They were sitting in their kitchen, the same kitchen where they had ignored me for 20 years. I didn't say hello. I shared my screen. I put up the bank transfer details, the PI report, the flight manifest, and the forged power of attorney documents. I walked them through the timeline with the precision of a forensic accountant. Here is where Tyler gained access to your accounts. Here is where he liquidated your retirement. Here is the fraudulent loan. Here is the transfer to the Cayman Islands. And here finally is the check you sent me funded by the theft of your own future. Silence. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal, a high, keen whimper. My father just stared, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. The denial came first, of course. No, he whispered. Tyler wouldn't. He's a visionary. He's just moving funds around. He's in Bali, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through his delusion. He has a one-way ticket. He isn't coming back, and you are facing foreclosure, bankruptcy, and potential criminal liability for the debts he racked up in your name. The breakdown happened in stages. My mother started sobbing, rocking back and forth. My father slumped in his chair, the arrogance draining out of him until he looked like a husk. They started begging, not for Tyler to come back, but for me to help. Sophia, please, my mother wept. We'll lose the house. We'll go to jail. You have money. You can fix this. You're the smart one. You always were. The smart one. The words hung in the air, bitter and toxic. Now I was smart. Now I was capable. Now that their golden boy had set the house on fire, they remembered I knew how to use a hose. I can fix it, I said slowly. Hope flared in their eyes, pathetic and desperate. But my help comes with conditions. I laid them out. I would hire a forensic accountant and a criminal defense attorney to prove the fraud and clear their names. I would pay the legal fees. I would negotiate with the bank to delay foreclosure while the investigation proceeded. But I would not pay their debts. I would not replace their retirement fund. And most importantly, they would sign a document, a legal binding contract relinquishing any future claim on my finances or my time. I would help them survive this, but I would never, ever be their daughter again. I would be their benefactor, their savior, but never their child. And Tyler, I added, my voice turning to ice. You will press charges. You will cooperate fully with the authorities to have him extradited. If you try to protect him, if you send him $1, one text message warning him, I walk away. And I take my lawyers with me. They stared at me horrified. I was asking them to destroy their idol, to choose survival over their favorite son. It was the ultimate test, and we all knew it. My father looked at my mother. She was weeping into her hands. He looked back at the screen at the daughter he had looked through for 28 years. He nodded. Okay, he whispered. Okay. It wasn't a victory. It was a demolition. I had stripped them of their delusions, their pride, and their golden child. I had bought their safety with my own success, but in doing so I had severed the last emotional tie. They weren't my parents anymore. They were just two people I used to know who owed me everything. The rain in Seattle is different tonight. It doesn't sound like a storm against the glass anymore. It sounds like applause. I stand in the center of my loft, surrounded by the quiet hum of the server rack that powers my empire. It has been 3 months since the video call that ended my childhood. My parents are safe. They are living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Portland. It is small, clean, and entirely paid for by me. I send the checks directly to the landlord. I pay their utility bills through an automated system. They have food, heat, and shelter. But they do not have my phone number. They communicate with me through a paralegal at the firm I hired to handle their bankruptcy. Tyler is still a fugitive, though the authorities are closing in. My parents cooperated with the investigation not because they wanted to, but because the contract I made them sign left them no choice. They had to sacrifice their golden child to survive. I imagine that haunts them. I imagine the silence in their small apartment is deafening. But that is their architecture, not mine. People ask me why I helped them. Why I didn't just let them drown in the flood they created. This brings me to what I call the rescue paradox. We are conditioned to believe that saving someone is always an act of love or forgiveness, but sometimes rescue is the ultimate act of dominance. If I had walked away, I would have been the angry daughter who abandoned her family. I would have carried the weight of their destruction. I became the competent adult in a room full of children. I proved with mathematical precision that the worthless child was the only one capable of survival. I didn't save them to earn their love. I saved them to render their approval obsolete. I paid for their lives so I would never have to pay for their mistakes again. I bought my freedom. I look at my reflection in the dark window. For 28 years I was the glass child, transparent, fragile, easily overlooked. But glass, when subjected to enough heat and pressure, changes. I am not glass anymore. I am a diamond. I am hard. I am unbreakable, and I am valuable on my own terms. I didn't just build a business in the shadows, I built a fortress, and for the first time in my life, the walls are strong enough to keep everything else out. If you have ever had to build your own worth from scratch, share this story. You are the architect of your own life.